Hello everyone and welcome to this week's screencast for Harmony and Analysis 110, and this week we're talking about soprano and bass lines. So we're flipping everything from last week. So as opposed to analysing chords and thinking about formal functional harmony from an analytical perspective, we're going to be crafting formal functional harmony. So we'll be writing music in a style that follows the rules or some of the guidelines about what we learned last week in terms of approaching chords from the diatonic world and constructing relationships between chords that function in a formal way. But we're going to be doing that writing in a style, and that style is going to be SATB style. And the reason we're going to be learning SATB style is firstly because it's a good way to consider voice leading in general, which is the way that notes move within one particular part from note to note or chord to chord. And that has a lot of different applications in analysis to all sorts of styles of music. And then also because when we think about SATB, we're not just thinking about the vocal parts, we're not just thinking about singers, we're thinking about a scaffold of different registers and different voices that have different functions. And that also has lots of applications to different areas, which we'll discuss a little bit later on as we work through the slides. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is the bass line. So the bass line leads the chords. We learnt last week that the bass is very important as it indicates what the inversion is of the chord that we're hearing, and that we include that in the analysis so that we know precisely what the function of the chord is, because when chords are in different inversions, their function can be a little bit different, particularly in second inversion, but we won't get to that just yet. So the bass line has a very specific role. Now, when we're writing in formal systems, when we're thinking about SATB style, also when we're talking about other systems, keyboard style or counterpoint, it's the outer voices that are the most important. That's why we start learning about soprano and bass first. That's why it's covered first in the textbook, because it's those outer voices that have specific roles and that do specific things in chord progressions, whereas the inner voices tend to fill out the harmony. That's been challenged quite a bit since the time of Bach, who is the composer that we often look at when we're learning about these formal systems. Formal functional harmony becomes much more readily accepted across Europe around the time of Bach. And so back to the bass line. So the bass line dictates a lot of this information about the harmonic progression and importantly the inversion. Now, one thing to remember about the bass line is that it can move using quite wide, large intervals, and what it does is it often firmly places the chords over certain areas. We still hear that in all sorts of styles of music, from classical music through to jazz standards, through to pop music. The bass line is often going to move around by quite large leaps, and it's going to outline the chords. It's going to move in larger intervals. So if we were to have a look at an example, here I've taken one from Bach, good old Bach, although it's very rare for me to put a lot of Bach into my lectures. However, you can see that in contrast to the other parts, the bass line in this example is moving by much larger leaps. Fourths, thirds, octaves, fifths are much more common. So it doesn't sound necessarily melodic, but that's because its role is not necessarily to be melodic, it's to underpin the voices that are moving above it. This is quite a wild bass line too, in terms of the way that it has these large leaps, especially in that second bar where it has an octave and then a fifth. That's quite unusual, and as is often the case, that goes against the prescribed rules. Normally, we would not follow a leap of an octave with another leap of a fifth. That is unusual. We could argue that in this case, because there is a fermata over that third beat of the second bar, the E flat, then perhaps it's okay to have had two leaps one after the other because the movement is suddenly suspended. after these chords move. So even though there's quite a bit of movement, it doesn't sound quite as disjointed, perhaps. But yes, that is moderately unusual. But you can already see that the bass line has a very different contour to the other vocal parts, which means that you have some freedom in writing your bass lines as well to have a little bit more movement. So if we think about the soprano line is the most prominent voice. Sopra, which means above in Italian and Latin, I assume, but don't quote me on that. The soprano is the line that we hear the most. It's the uppermost, it's certainly the one that's going to cut through the ensemble the most. And so we want to think about what makes a good melody in a formal functional style. So we have a smooth contour, we use lots of seconds and thirds, and we also want it to have a bit of variety, so we try to move in different directions. We don't want to have a soprano melody that sounds like a scale. We want to have a melody that has a bit of movement. So we suddenly have a little bit of interest, depending on what sort of chorale we're trying to write. There are lots of different types of chorale as well. And I would encourage you all to try to think about what sort of chorale you would like to write for the assessments. When we're starting out, we're just going to opt for the basics. So we don't want to have a melody that moves around too much. We don't want to have a melody that is too scalic or moves by long series of steps. So we want to have just the right balance of that. And so, yes, the soprano also has quite a bit of freedom. The inner parts have the least freedom, which we'll talk about next week, but the soprano part has the most freedom. So use it. So if we have a look at that same example, we'll notice that we have over the first bar, this scale descending. However, it doesn't, then things change a little bit. So we have this balance. It's interesting that the soprano then has the same figure in bar 1 and bar 3, but the other parts change their approach. But yeah, so the second bar has some repeated notes, some fourths, some changes in direction, and this offsets the scale that opens the piece quite nicely. So those are the things we're mainly trying to think about when we're writing in formal style for the soprano and the bass voice. Now what we do, we're not going to jump right into a chorale, we're going to begin with 2 voices only. We're just going to think about these 2 voices acting in relation to one another, and then what we do is we fill out the inner parts. So formal chord progressions must begin on chord 1 major or chord 1 minor, and the bass must be on the tonic, and the soprano can either be on the 3rd or the 5th. Ideally, it sits on the 3rd because what this does is establishes whether the key area is major or minor. However, this example that I have below starts on the 5th, which is not unusual, and it's certainly not illegal in any sense. And you can, an open 5th just doesn't sort of sound as nice, if you ask me. So if we hear this beginning, that's our opening 5th to begin, and we know that we're in B, but we don't know if we're in B major or minor. So if it was a D sharp, we would know that we were in B major, and that has a slightly nicer sonority to it in this style. But this example is in B minor, so there would just be a D natural, and we would have this instead. Oh. I'm adding in sharps where there shouldn't be. Maybe I gravitate towards the major scale. So the start needs to be in those systems. So if we have a look at this example, you'll see that the bass part does indeed have larger leaps and tends to move around a little bit more than the soprano line, and that the soprano has a nice balance of movements by step, changes in direction, some thirds. It follows those rules that we were thinking about. Now, do we want to talk about the 7th of the minor scale, or do I want to talk about that later? I might talk about that later. I might talk about that next week. Since I think that the examples that I've got you writing this week for the activities are in major keys. The 7th of the minor scale is a little bit tricky. We try to avoid using it for if it's going to outline an augmented interval. But that's by the by. You'll see in this example that we have some A's that are natural and some A's that are sharp, depending on what the function of that A is. If it's resolving to the B, it will be sharped. If it's falling scalically down in a descending passage, it will generally be natural. And of course that may spark some of you as being the characteristics of the melodic minor scale. And it is indeed that, melodic, whether it's rising up to the tonic or melodically moving down. Something to keep in mind, we might raise that in the forums as well, as a bit of a discussion about the melodic minor scale. Now, when we're writing with two parts, we aim for thirds, fifths, sixths, and octaves. We want everything to be nice and consonant. There's not a lot of room for dissonance because the two voices are so exposed. However, the dissonances that we do have allowed is within the dominant seventh chord. So if I was in F major, then I have the dominant seventh chord, which is C7, 5-7. And within that chord, there are a number of potential dissonances that I can have. A minor 7, a major second, a diminished fifth, and an augmented fourth. And so depending on how my two voices are going to voice those notes, the resolution to chord 1 is going to be in a different way. So if I had a minor 7, the voices are going to fall inward towards the major third of on the tonic. If I have that major second, one is going to stay on the common tone, and the scale degree 4 is going to fall down to the third. Now the diminished fifth has a really lovely resolution because it moves by semitone. Resolutions by semitone are the most comfortable because we can hear that they're almost where they want to be. And so in this case you have both the fourth scale degree, which falls down to the third, and the leading tone, which rises to the tonic. And so when we have them together, everything falls into its harmonic center, its comfortable place. Similarly, the augmented fourth has the same notes, but because we've just inverted the diminished fifth, the same resolution, but it's inverted, so the parts move outward. And again, we get that comfortable resolution. So there are dissonances involved. If we have a look at the Bach chorale that we were looking at before, we see that the intervals are indeed very comfortable. We have a fifth, which moves to an octave, third, third, fifth, third, sixth, third, and then an octave. So we're moving through these lovely consonant intervals. Lovely. I shouldn't say lovely. Aren't they lovely? That's neither here nor there. There's lots of ways for a piece of music to be lovely, but it just uses very common harmonizing intervals, like the third and the sixth. And we hear those, again, in popular music, we hear them in folk songs, we hear them in all sorts of places. Singing along in thirds is a common way to harmonize a chord. So we're just sort of used to it. It's a comfortable harmony. There are other sorts of harmonies we can have as well, but in the formal style, we gravitate towards those sort of tried and tested. Maybe too tried and tested, but that's neither here nor there. So as I said, these cadential patterns, the outer voices are the ones that will provide this particular movement for in the case of creating this idea of a perfect cadence. If we've just got two notes that are outlining two notes of the dominant seventh chord. So ideally the bass part will be moving by a larger interval from chord 5 to chord 1. However, there are other ways. The chord 5 may rise by semitone in the case of that diminished interval. And the soprano has more freedom. The soprano can end on the third, it can end on the tonic. Ideally, it'll end on one of those, the first or the third. It won't end on the fifth. Because it's the most prominent voice, we don't really want that prominent voice to end on the fifth, which is a very unresolved sound in the scale. If we end with the soprano on the C, it sounds like it's not quite done yet. It wants to fall either to the tonic or to the third. Whereas the fifth can be outlined in the other voices that we have in the inharmony. So it fills out the chord, but it doesn't sound quite as... I just want it to fall down to the tonic. And this came up a little bit in our discussion about dominant seventh chords, leading so comfortably to that tonic area. So what are some other things we can think about when we're writing in just two voices to introduce you to some ideas of non-chord tones? So non-chord tones are notes that don't exist in that consonant, nice-sounding world, and we use them as either passing notes or neighbour notes. So often chord tones are the third, the fifth, or the seventh above the root note, and we might at sometimes want to have the other intervals as well. And these are a very common way to embellish a melody, and we've already seen them in that Bach chorale that we looked at earlier, so we'll have another look at that. And often what it does is this occurs between the beats. So if we're in 4/4, the quavers between the beats will have passing notes. If I was in F major and I had the soprano moving from one beat on a C to the next beat to an A, I may want it to pass through B flat. And that is a passing note. We'll have a look at some examples of that. Neighbour notes are notes that briefly move away from and then come back to a chord tone. So if I had two Cs. So let's have a look. So this example that we have in the first bar is, so we're not in F anymore, we're in C, I guess. So it's moving from chord 1 to chord 4, and we have this passing note over the B natural. The neighbour note, you can see we're moving from A minor to D minor. And if we have this little neighbour note, because the soprano is just staying on that A, it can briefly move up to the B. And anticipation is when the chord tone moves slightly earlier than necessary to the note that it's about to move on to. So the chord progression in the third example is from D minor to G. And what the soprano can do in this example can move to that B a little bit early. And the anticipation is quite nice because it sounds like it's going to be a neighbour tone, but it ends up staying on that note, which is slightly unexpected. It's a nice device to use. We won't talk about 4 and 5, we might revisit 4 and 5 later on. But those three are the main ones, and we've definitely seen those in... there's another example. Do I have the slide for the Bach chorale? I have a different Bach chorale. So the other example of non-chord tones that I wanted to briefly talk about are suspensions. We'll learn more about these in counterpoint, but they do appear, I believe, in the textbook, so I just wanted to touch on them. They don't quite make sense. The way the textbook explains them with two parts doesn't quite make sense because the suspensions don't operate exactly within the chords, so it's not quite clear exactly what they're doing. In the second last bar, you'll see we have these notes where a note is held. So in this case, we have this C sustained in bar 9 across to bar 10, and it moves into the dissonant world. So we would ordinarily not have a dissonant interval on the first beat of the bar, but because this top line is staying on the C natural while the bass line moves to the B flat, we briefly have this dissonance, but this is a 9/8 suspension, so it's the interval of the ninth, and then the top line is going to fall to the B flat. So we get this, we call it a suspension, where a note is suspended briefly, and then there is a resolution of that note which has been suspended. So the C is suspended against the B flat, and then falls to resolve to the octave. And then we have another one, so the B is then suspended and becomes a fourth, which resolves to a third. And then the entire piece resolves by way of a perfect cadence in the two parts. Don't need to worry so much about that, but I'm just flagging it now. So when it comes to non-chord tones, all the examples we've looked at have been in simple time, so 4/4 mainly. However, note that one of your assessment tasks is in 6/8, and I just wanted to flag the fact that in 6/8 there's a little bit more freedom because we have dotted crotchet notes, we have crotchets and then quavers, or we have 3 quavers, and it's your choice about whether you want some of those quavers to be passing notes, whether you want to change chord on every note, or whether you want to have a chord across an entire beat, which is a dotted crotchet. But don't simply have a chord on every bar, one chord for every bar, because the notes won't quite make sense. You need to make sure that the notes that are there are going to outline a passing note of some kind. Non-chord tone, so it could be a passing note or a neighbour note. And you'll see here that, so this example is not in 6/8, but it's in 3/4, which is a little bit different to 4/4, and you'll notice that sometimes the chord changes every bar, sometimes the chord changes twice, where it's held across a minimum and then a crotchet, and then sometimes we have a chord that's held for an entire bar, sort of, or maybe with a slight change, as is the case in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, bar 8. Oh, bar 8 changes as well. We don't have any examples of a chord being held for an entire bar. Not that I can see. So, but there's a little bit more freedom as evidenced in this example in terms of where exactly you want to put the chord changes. When there's only one part filled in, you have quite a bit of freedom. So if you ever want to check anything with me, just send it to me and say, hey, Paul, does this work, or do I need to do it in a slightly different way? And I can let you know about that. So the other thing that I wanted to say is that when we talk about SATB, it's not just vocal styles, it's not just chorale, and it's certainly not just Bach. Although we're working roughly within the formal approach, or we learn the basics of the functional harmony approach, there are lots of different applications to this, certainly in a lot of pop music examples. And in this example, which works quite logically, the string quartet. So we have 2 upper voices, which operate as the soprano and alto, and then we have a tenor line, which is the viola, and then we have a bass line, which is the cello. So we have these 4 parts that are single melodies that operate very much as 4 parts with 2 outer voices. And this example, which is by the Russian composer César Sui. I've never looked up exactly how to pronounce his last name, so somebody tell me if they know. And you'll see that the bass line moves with some larger intervals. Whereas the melody has a little bit more variety. And so some of the principles that we've learned about Bach chorales in the late 18th or 18th century style have carried well over into the principles of writing for multiple instruments of different voice types, in this example, which is 19th century Russian string music. So these principles go in lots of different directions. They're not just about writing vocal harmonies. Some of the principles we learn have lots of different applications, and you'll start to see those applications too once you know them. Even in pop music that I was listening to, I was just listening to, and I'm listening to the bass line, I'm listening to some songs randomly on the radio or whatever, and I'm so aware of the fact that the bass line is moving by large leaps and it's outlining the chords, whereas the vocalist or the melody line has these variety, it's moving by different shapes, it's moving smoother than the bass line, and then we have different synth parts or whatever parts they're going to be that are outlining inner voices in the middle. So it's quite becoming aware of those things and being aware of how these things sort of spread across lots of different musical examples is one of the key benefits to learning these fundamentals. So that's it for this week. There are some activities in 2 parts. We've learned about the fundamentals. We're not moving away from analysis entirely, and next week we'll look at working with 4 parts and some of the things that we need to think about when we write with 4 parts. But that's all for this week, and I look forward to discussing these things with you in the forums.